says, well, I started with Sperry in the fall of 1933. Sperry was hiring physics PhDs to start a new research laboratory. I think I was the second or third one hired. And for quite a number of years, from 33 until maybe about 37 or so, each one of us knew laboratory people. They were all physicists. Worked on their own, pretty much by themselves on projects. For example, I did airplane soundproofing. I soundproofed the Martin China Clipper, the Sikorsky flying boats for Pan American, and so on. Then there were interspersed in between times, there were other odd jobs, like another fellow and I built a infrared airplane detector, which detected the heat from the exhaust pipes on the airplane through a big mirror arrangement.
What years of this?
That would have been in 1934, 35 in there. We could follow an airplane for about five miles with that. But anyway, along in I think early 1937, I got involved with the bomb sight project because the gyroscopes that, well, first of all, it was a very secret project. I didn't even know that Sperry had a bomb sight project until I sat down with two of the people on it in the executive dining room one noon and found out that they'd been out to Wright Field and they had failed a bomb sight test out there. And the project was going to get washed out unless they could find improved gyroscopes. And it just turned out that another chap and I had developed a high-speed, very precise gyroscope about a year before, and it had been sitting on the shelf waiting for an application. And these fellows admitted to me at the lunch table that they had this problem, and unless they found an answer, they were washed out. The project was finished. And I said, well, I just happen to know about a gyroscope that's just waiting for something like this. And we sold it, and that's what saved the bomb sight. That got me into the bomb sight business through the gyroscopes. And the next thing that happened was that I started going out on bombing tests along with others. At this point, I didn't even know Halpert, didn't know Hal at all. And I got more and more involved in bomb sights, and we found out that the bombing problem required that the pilot of the airplane and the bombardier who ran the bomb site had to be very compatible in the operation, or the bombing run would have be a failure, because if the pilot didn't hold a steady course or made erratic movements, or if the bombardier sent erratic signals, they'd get all mixed up and you'd just have confusion. So it was decided that you needed to fly the airplane automatically from the bomb site. And so you washed out that duplicate human error. So that got me interested in autopilots. And we first connected then the old commercial autopilot, the old commercial Sperry autopilot, with the bomb sight, which was a real Rube Goldberg. And the autopilot wasn't suitable anyway in the first place. But we made enough of those to outfit the first 13 or so airplanes that were sent to Great Britain on Lend-Lease, B-17s. And then we decided we needed a totally new autopilot, that this old autopilot wasn't suitable. And I started that project at that point. Now, that had to be around 1938, probably, somewhere in there. We can go through some of the old patents that I have here later and probably establish those dates more precisely. In any case, my new automatic pilot project then by that time, I had an outline in my mind what this should be, how it should be put together, and so on. And I started working on it, and I soon learned that I needed help. I was now all by myself. I finally had a secretary. That's all I had. And she wasn't any good for working on bomb sites. Anyway, I told my boss, I said, well, it's gotten to the point where I can't handle this anymore. I got to have some help. And they said, well, we'll look around. And it turned out that there was a guy by the name of Percy Halpert in the test department that was overqualified as a tester, very much overqualified. He had a physics degree or something from City College. He was a real smart, sharp kid. And they thought he ought to be my helper. So I looked over his application. I, among other things, found out that he was a Presbyterian, which I thought was kind of funny. But anyway, I took him on.
He had Presbyterian put down on
his application. I wasn't sure then that he was Jewish, but I suspected it when I saw that Presbyterian stuff. Anyway, he joined up. And he then did the electronics for that autopilot. I more or less knew what we wanted to do, but he carried it out. And as a matter of fact, that was the kind of guy I was looking for. I was looking for a guy who knew all about vacuum tubes and electronics, and he fitted the bill perfectly. So we took off. We went on our way, and we set a lot of records in how fast we got some things done. Then the company in 1939 bought an airplane for test purposes, and I'll show you a picture later of Hal sitting in that airplane doing experiments, and so on and so on. But anyway, now I get down to the first time I met Ruth. We were working pretty much 7 days a week. That's how urgent things were. And I went in there fairly early one Sunday morning, and I was all alone. The building was locked. I had a key to get in, but the building was locked. This is Flatbush Avenue Extension. You know where the building is?
Yeah.
Right at the end of the bridge.
Right.
And I called up Hal and said, gee, I'm at the plant. I said, you think you could come in? He said, sure. So I had to go down to unlock the door for him, when the side door on the side street, when he got there. And I was out waiting for him, and here they pulled up, he and Ruth together. And I walked over to the car and looked in, and they had a picnic basket all packed. And he was coming in to work. And Ruth chewed me out. I'll never forget it. First time I met her, what I was doing to her picnic. I don't know if she remembers it or not, but it was very interesting. I never made that mistake again after that. Well, anyway, he was a terrific guy. He really knew what he was doing. He was a real electronics expert. And we made the first electronic autopilot in history. Called it the A5 pilot, which was then married with the Sperry bomb sight. And you could fly the airplane from the bomb site, make maneuvers all over, do this and do that. And very precise, and that was the framework then for all the subsequent electronic autopilots that Sperry built. And here's a picture of all of the airplanes that had follow-on pilots that had their birth in the A5. Now, these are not A5 autopilots in these airplanes. These are future developments. And Hal is responsible for every one of these. There's Douglas DC-8s, Convair 880s, Lockheed Jetstar, DC-6, Grumman Gulfstream, Army helicopters, Fairchild 27, Navy WF-2F, Convair 990 jet, that's a jet, Navy A-2F, that's a Navy fighter, B-47 Air Force, B-52 Air Force, and they were even starting developments for the supersonic transport. Hal's the father of that whole bunch of autopilots. Now, what else can I tell you?
Well, back to the 30s, Sperry and the gyro. I want to know some of the technical developments and how they developed. Because you came in, you were hired by Sperry, and Sperry had what was Sperry doing at the time before this, like pre-World War II? This is how long were they around? What's their history, and what
Sperry?
What did you work? You said there was an automatic pilot that was existing, but it wasn't.
Yeah, it was a pneumatic-driven thing. You drove it with a vacuum pump attached to the engine, and they had very small rotors in it, and they were very crude instruments, really, like today's comparison to today. But those were the first flight instruments of any kind that enabled blind flying. Jimmy Doolittle, you know who he is.
I know.
He's an Air Force general. He's about 96 years old. But he's about to die, I think. He was the guy that ran the raid on Tokyo in World War II. You don't know about that. 30 seconds over Tokyo. Did you see the movie?
No.
You don't know?
No.
Well, Doolittle made the first blind takeoff and landing at Mitchell Field on Long Island in about 1928 with Sperry instruments. They were first available then, and he used them to take off, make a turn, and come back and land under a canopy so he couldn't see. Now, he had a pilot in the back to make sure he didn't crack up or something, but
Right.
He did it all by himself.
So Sperry was developed as an instrument company. What was the birth? Sperry's birth was the gyroscope.
Was a gyrocompass
Gyrocompass.
for ships. For ships. Matter of fact, there's a history down there in that book of old man Sperry.
Okay, and then now all the information that I have been given through my family is that Pete developed the gyrocompass. Did he develop the gyrocompass for aviation, or is it completely different, or electronic?
That's probably a little bit in error. He made some contributions to the gyrocompass, but the gyrocompass goes all the way back to 1910 originally. Hal and I made an improvement in it, a big improvement, when we used the servo system that we had on the autopilot. We applied that to the gyrocompass. So he did work on a compass, there's no mistake about that. And it doubled or tripled the accuracy performance of that compass, the new servo system that we put on it. That's true, yeah. But the compass itself was much older.
Okay.
Now, here's his picture working in our company airplane. You of course weren't around, I guess, when he. How old are you?
23. He
23.
died 2 years before I was born.
He died before that. Yeah. Now, that's Hal right there.
Look in You get it? Okay.
You want to do these
Let's
airplanes?
do the airplanes.
I'm gonna be with the first one.
So the 28 patents are
I don't.
joint.
I never knew exactly how many he had. I only know what I had. I had about altogether about 23, I think. And a lot of those were in combination with Hal.
Yeah, I have copies that I got from Ruth in '85, and I lent them to a cousin of mine. I haven't seen them since, but I remember seeing your name on a lot of the patents.
Yeah, we had a lot of patents together. Let's see. He's on that one.
Electro-hydraulic control system.
And he's on this one.
This is 1940. Now, was a lot of this work driven because of the war?
Oh,
This-
yes.
the speed.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah, all of this, almost all of this was.
So as soon as these things were created, they went right into production.
No, some of these never went into production, but they were sort of ancillary ideas. This is the A5 patent right here. Filed, my gosh, that wasn't filed until 1942. Here's another one where,
So this isn't filed for 42, but it was used immediately
oh,
in
yeah,
the bombers.
we sent a Lend-Lease bomber that had it to England in April of 41.
Wow. Now this is all with tubes and
Yeah, it's with electronics.
Try to-
how did you develop into the 50s and 60s?
Well, those are improved versions. They almost, except for the basic physical principle, they don't bear any resemblance to the A5 anymore. The servo system's different, everything's different. And of course, eventually they dropped the vacuum tubes and went into solid state,
That's
finally.
that now, because I saw. I guess you were doing designing cockpits, doing flight instruments, and I think the last thing that Pete might have worked on was 727. Do you know if that's correct?
The autopilot. As a matter of fact, when the 727 came into being, he was then in charge of the plant here in Phoenix. He was running that. I don't know what title he had, whether he was the manager or whether he was president. At some point, this man got to be a president to run this company. And he was instrumental in selling the autopilot for the 727 to Boeing, the Sperry autopilot. And the Boeing people, we never forgot this, what happened. The Boeing people said, you're lucky guys, before you're through, we will have built 1,000 of these airplanes. And Hal said to them, if you get to the 1,000th airplane, I'll donate the autopilot for that airplane if you make that many. You know how many they made? Over 2,000. And when the 1,000th airplane, the Boeing guys made notes of what Hal told them. When they delivered the 1,000th airplane, they called up Sperry. By that time, Hal was no longer here. And said, we've built the 1,000th airplane. You made a promise. instead of giving them a pilot, they donated $20,000 to some scholarship fund at Boeing. And your Aunt Ruth was in the celebration.
And my Aunt Ruth mentioned, I remember her mentioning that
She-
story.
Yeah. But that's something.
So I remember seeing the plaques. I think that plaque's in her house.
It is.
Yeah. I remember seeing that.
That was terrific. Well, they've built a lot more airplanes with Sperry stuff in them. Now, I don't know whether you have this or not, but after the A5 pilot was developed, we were afraid that it would get away from us from a point of view of publicity and maybe even patents or copy. So in June of '44, Hal wrote this article and he put it into a technical magazine which has all of the physics and science that's at the basis of the A5 autopilot spelled out in great detail. And that's all in, that handwriting in there is all in his handwriting. The equation.
And this on the front, that's Ali Esval.
He was his boss then. By that time, I was no longer associated with any of this. I got bumped up into management. At that point, I was running the research lab. So I was not directly, Hal and Esval worked for me then, because I was, let's see what they call me. They call me research director or something like that. A year after that, I got to be a vice president. But anyway, so I had lost track of the details of what Hal and Esval and these fellows were doing. Esval was the guy that developed that high-speed gyroscope that saved the bomb site originally. And he was a department head then in '44, and Halpert was a senior engineer under him.
Let's see, where's that piece of paper?
You can have that. Take that with you.
Oh, great. But I have, trying to think of the other people who I've spoken to. Yeah, I think Ali Esval, I think George Jude told me he was in North Carolina.
He is.
And,
North Carolina.
yeah, I'm going to try to get in touch with him. And then I spoke with George Jude, Raleigh Wagner, Cecil.
Is Wagner still alive?
Yeah, he is.
Yeah. Wagner was one of Hal's favorites. He was really sort of the automatic pilot heir to Hal later, after Hal got into management more.
And then I'm going to get in touch with Cecil Pine.
Yeah, is he out here? I don't know how much Cecil knew.
They're all in Arizona.
They're all in Arizona.
Except for Esval.
Yeah.
And they're all in Phoenix. And then I spoke with Pete Peterson, who's the person who gave me all the information.
He's in Payson. He lives in Payson.
Yeah, they said, because I went up to Honeywell, and I spoke to people there, and they said they brought him out of retirement to do some work. And that's how,
Oh, Peterson?
yeah, and that's how I got his name.
Really?
Yeah, it was like last, I forgot who I spoke to. I just drove up there, I saw Honeywell, and I didn't even know where the mergers had.
It's up on 19th Avenue.
Right, it was, Hidden Valley, no, that's not Hidden Valley Road.
Happy Valley?
Yeah,
No,
Deer
it's
Valley.
Deer Valley Road.
Deer Valley Road.
Deer
And I
Valley.
drove by Honeywell, and I decided to just drive in there,
Yeah.
and I just walked in and told them who I was, and most of the scientists, most of the people working the flight instrument there were in their 30s or 40s.
They probably didn't even remember Halpert.
Yeah, but they knew Pete mentioning people, and they knew that he was in his 70s,
Oh.
and that's how I got, and then it was just one person after another until I got to you.
Well, what happened, I'll just finish the story, I guess. we moved Halpert out here when it became obvious that this place was doing all right, but they needed more weight in the direction of new development. This place started manufacturing things that were all developed in Great Neck, that Halpert and Esfall and also I had developed. As a matter of fact, they're still making one product that Esfall developed that didn't hit production until 1942. Now that's 50 years ago. They're still making that product. Some of that now. But anyway,
What is that?
it was a Jarrison compass, called a Jarrison compass. It was a gyroscope that was a slave to a magnetic compass put out in the wing of the airplane where there are no magnetic disturbances. And before they didn't have that. You had a very wiggly, erratic compass like you have in your car when you drive and it bumps around. And then you had a little gyroscope on the dashboard that you could set by that. And it would hold you steady for maybe 10-minute intervals, and then you had to keep resetting it all the time. This device made corrections on that gyro so it stayed accurate all the time, magnetically. We call it the Jarrison compass. Now, Halpert didn't have anything to do with that development, but of course when he was sent out here to run the plant, then the production was under him. Well, anyway, he was out here, and we got into real bad trouble in Great Neck with about 3 different projects, big projects, where we had engineers that tried to be salesmen instead of good engineers, and they got into real trouble. And we brought, we'd had a number of people, we'd moved them out, so we were management-wise very thin back there. And these projects, there was about 3 of them that were in deep trouble and losing their shirt. And we brought Halpert back to run the Great Neck operation and get on top of these things. And I'm sure that this had something to do with his heart attack, because it was a terrible mess. As a matter of fact, the day before he had the heart attack, he and I were standing there in a test rig that had to do with the computerization of the New York City traffic business. It was a computerized traffic control system for New York City. And these guys had actually cheated on their test results, the engineers had. And Hal and I were in the midst of smoking this out when he had his heart attack. Now, he'd had a heart attack before that I didn't even know about in L.A. And matter of fact, he was taken off of an airplane in L.A. once with abdominal pains, and they got him in the hospital and took him up all apart and looked him over. Couldn't find anything wrong, put him back together again. But anyway, this was a terrible strain on him. Of course, he was also building a house at the same time, a new house. And he didn't survive it. But, see, what did I start to tell you about? I had something else on my mind to tell you. Well, anyway, he was in charge of the Great Neck operation when he died. And he was well on the way to solving it when it happened.
And what happened to the project?
Well, one of them was canceled at one point, and I don't remember. The other two were they went on beyond after I retired. I think they finally sort of managed to eke out after they'd lost a lot of money on it.
And that determined which direction Sperry went? Because at that point it was still Sperry by itself.
Oh yeah, still Sperry.
And then, but because of financial problems, because of, were these projects so major that it could have determined mergers, becoming Sperry Rand,
No,
or
not
things
really
like that?
not really that. The big shock was that we had been the most profitable in the corporation, and I don't think we ever got to the point where we really lost money overall, but it got pretty thin. Pretty thin. Well, this is the bomb site article that was printed in the, I'll let you have a copy of that too. Unfortunately, that thing was, that article was, this is a draft of the original article. You see how much it was cut down by the magazine people. They really shortened it, but matter of fact, you can have a couple of these if you like.
Oh, this is,
That's about the bomb site.
George Jude mentioned this to me. This is talking about Sperry and Norden.
Yeah, yeah.
Now the other thing, that one article that I read that my uncle wrote, I think is maybe 63, because I have a photograph of him with the first microcomputer, I think in '58.
Yeah, but I'm not too familiar with that.
Okay, because I
58, that would have been microcomputer.
there's a picture of him with a congressman, and they're looking over there's no other titles, there's no other article with it. It just says Percy Halpert and the congressman with his
I
microcomputer.
don't know who the congressman was.
I don't remember it. I don't have the.
Was it Long Island congressman?
I think it might have been Great Neck, so somewhere in Long Island.
That would have been.
This is with the technology changing. It seemed the article that I read that.
Oh, we were going from vacuum tubes to a solid state.
Right, and he was. I don't know the whole gist of the article. But the article seemed to be predicting what the future of aviation.
Yeah, probably was.
And he was writing it well before the computers could do any of the things that he was predicting.
Yeah.
But he was also writing it almost in defense of. It was written in a tone where he was defending against skeptics that these things were ever going to happen.
Oh.
And
Yeah. Well, that's right.
what ramifications did the work that you did together with space exploration or all these things? These are all the ancestors of all the work that.
The stuff in those airplanes that's pretty much the ancestor line of a lot of the stuff that went into space. That's right.
And then a lot of it developed after you had it as electronics. A lot of it developed. The computers took over after a while.
Yeah, sure.
And my cousin Billy was telling me a story about he's a civil engineer. Well, in my family, all these I'm too young to have met Pete, but there's a lot of scientists or scientifically based people who all got their inspiration from my uncle. My cousin Billy is a civil engineer. My cousin Bobby is an inventor, and then chemists, and my cousin Donnie, who works for the federal government, is a scientist, and all their background was
They all sort of had roots back to Hal.
all back to Percy.
Really?
Yeah. So for me, that's one of the reasons I'm trying to find out exactly what was accomplished.
Yeah.
This is part of it?
Well,
The S1 bomb sight computer?
that was the S1. That was actually a modification that IBM made. IBM made those bomb sights too during the war, and they made a modification. But this kid up in Boston, this guy that wrote that article, he found that bomb sight and was so enamored with it that he fished around until he found me and 2 or 3 other fellows to help him write this article, which turned up to be, that article. Those prints, by the way, he tried to sell them, but they're no longer for sale.
Please.
He had big prints, like so, of that. That he sold for about $30 or $40, but they're no longer available.
I'd like to get in touch with him. He's
You want to get in touch with him?
Yeah, he's an artist?
Well, not really. He had an artist friend. He had an artist friend.
Okay.
And he made these nostalgic prints. He had another one of people sitting around an real old-fashioned radio set. These little boxes with a funny loudspeaker and so on.
Right.
That was some of his artist friends.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we had one other experience talking about this Presbyterian business on this application. Hal and I were in San Diego one time at Convair. I don't remember the year, but anyway, we ran into a Sperry service engineer that I had met while I was soundproofing the Sikorsky flying boats for Pan American. And we had lunch together, the 3 of us. We met this service engineer in San Diego. We had lunch at some restaurant right on the shore downtown San Diego, right next to the water. I've forgotten what the name, Red Sail or something like that restaurant. And by this time I never thought much about it, but by this time I was pretty sure that Albert was Jewish. We sat down for lunch, and this guy takes off on the Jews. And he wouldn't stop. And the table was arranged so I couldn't kick him in the shins. And this went on and on and on and on. I thought I'd die. I started watching Hal. He didn't blink an eye. And finally this guy got up and left. And I paid the check and we walked out. I didn't know what to say. Finally said to Hal, I said, God damn. I said, I thought people were judged individually, not by class. He says, yeah, damn it. He says, that's what I thought. That was
it.
That was it. That's what I thought. Yeah.
That's
Amazing. He was a great guy. We were very close. It was a big hole when he died.
You were about the same age?
I think I was probably older. I don't remember really what his age was.
He was.
And I don't know of any way to find out. No. I'm pretty sure that
He was 54. I think 54 when he died.
when he 54.
And he died in 66. Okay. misinformation.
66 he died?
Possibly. I'm trying to think. Might have been before that. My cousin Peter is named after him. And he was
Well,
born like a month
I
or
think
right after.
it might have been a little later than that. Might have been 66 or 6. Yeah, it probably was 66. Because I remember I had a serious operation in June of 67. I was in the hospital for about a month. And he was already gone then. I remember that. Yeah, he sure was all right. 54, that's pretty young.
Yeah. Well, I stated to all the information that I've gotten on his importance or who he was. Some information from my Aunt Ruth and Roger and Andy, and a lot of it from my grandmother when he was really young, because my grandmother enabled him to go to City University by adopting him because he
Yeah,
was
well,
a Catskill resident.
I didn't know that at all. I didn't know that part of it at all.
And I hear all the, like, his character, like that story in San Diego seemed, he had one pair of pants and all these mythical type stories of just him enduring
Yeah.
and going through things. And
I'll tell you another story about not too long after he came to work for me, the Wage and Hour Act was passed about the 40-hour week in Washington. Everybody could only work a 40-hour week. If you worked more than that, overtime, you had to get paid time and a half, and so on and so on and so on. The company was so flabbergasted by all of this and so worried about breaking that law and the penalties associated with it that they handed out big red cards about so square that if somebody was, nobody could work overtime on their own choice. Mind you, we had been working, Hal and I and all the rest of us. We worked day and night. We sometimes would work till 11 o'clock at night and then go home. It'd be midnight by the time we got home. And you'd be back there at 8 the next morning. This is how we were working. And like this Sunday thing, we worked in on a Sunday when we felt like it. And Halpert was coming. He was coming in on Saturdays. He was, when he had a problem, he worked at it. Whether it was Sunday or Monday or Tuesday or what. I said to him, I had this big red card now. New law, I said. You can't work overtime anymore. He said, if you work overtime, this card has to be filled out, and you have to have approval. He says, what do you mean? If I want to work, I have to get approval? I don't understand that. I said, no, it's right. You can't work overtime without approval. He says, that's crazy. He just never... Of course, later on, when he got to be a manager, then you had to obey the law, and you had to obey the rules, and you had to do this, and you had to do that. But he just never quite got it straight that just because some jerk in the government wanted you to do something, that you had to have permission to work overtime. Well, that's the way it was. You never understood it.
so he just kept on working and working and working.
Not right away. It sort of all blew away finally, but later. But for a while, it scared the devil out of everybody, Well, what happened? They straightened it out because you didn't know that didn't apply to supervisors, for example. didn't apply to professional people like engineers, really, if they were really professionals. If they were hourly worker, though, then it applied. Or weekly workers too. There were three grades of workers. And of course, Hal would have been as professional as anybody ever got if you really wanted to talk about professionalism. He was a professional.
Well, he went to school on the East Coast, a city school, and Harriet said you went to school in Iowa, and
I did.
yeah,
Went to graduate school in Iowa.
where you went undergrad,
At Miami in Ohio.
I'm in Ohio, right?
Yeah.
And was there? Did you know? I'm guessing that the country might. I guess physics is the same. It's taught the same, but did your educational backgrounds ever come up, or by the time that you met, you were already way beyond what your the different philosophies in your teaching, in your education system?
I don't get you.
Well, I'm just saying if there's any difference between you getting a Midwest education and my uncle getting a city education, if there's a difference in philosophies
Not in those
or
days.
teaching matter.
Not in those days. I think it's happens, well, I think they've all gone crazy. East and West. No. The education system is not in very good shape right now. Matter of fact, I've got a lot of editorials and comments about that kind of thing. If you're interested in it, I'll give you copies of it.
Okay.
There's a guy in the Hoover Institute. You know what the Hoover Institute is? Out at Stanford.
Yeah.
This is a black guy by the name of Tom Sowell, S-O-W-E-L-L. And this guy is writing a lot of stuff that people ought to listen to. And one of the last ones of his blasts is headlined, "They are brainwashing the children." It's about the schools. How they're spending time teaching sex, teaching people to do a death watch, first and second graders, mind you. There's a big hassle apparently in a New York City school. I've forgotten what it was over, what they were teaching there, teaching the kids. He thought it would be a lot better if they dropped this kind of trash and started teaching kids how to multiply and write and read and spell, and forget about this other junk for a while. And that's the gist of the article. And this guy keeps writing things like this, and nobody pays any attention to him.
Yeah, because I was asking that because Iowa, you went to the schools have always had good reputations, and city universities
You know what?
have gotten knocks.
You know what they did at Iowa? Well, first, let me. I was going to tell you something else. Well, anyway, I subscribe to a thing called. There are two publications. One's called Accuracy in Media that catch up with the TV people and the newspaper people that are spreading some of this phony information, liberal information. And there's another thing called Accuracy in Academia about what's going on in the colleges. And I read in this Accuracy in Academia a story about something that happened at the University of Iowa, my old school. I had a German class, a story about a German class. And they had a videotape, German videotape that was made in Germany. It was not just plain ordinary pornography. It was just plain ordinary pornography plus unbelievable filth that they showed to this German class. It was a mandatory viewing. And I suppose the one redeeming thing about it was that it was probably in German, so that they were asked now to make a German discussion about the German aspect of it. And I was so furious about this thing that I sent the president a long letter and told him that when I went there, it had been a fairly civilized place, and I was sorry to see that the civilization had gone by the boards, and so on. So well, I got the stupidest answer. He didn't answer any of it. He didn't apologize for it. Nothing. And this is what's going on in the universities. Really.
Not to change the subject completely, but Harry would say that you speak fluent German.
Not very fluent anymore.
Speak German fluently, and I guess you figured out that Presbyterian was incorrect on Pete's application.
It didn't bother me.
Yeah, well, no, I'm just. How was there any? Because I mean, before World War II, people getting into World War II, especially if you're working for Sperry, and there's people like Lindbergh, who's a very famous pilot, telling the United States to stay out of the war.
Yeah.
And if you're close to your German ancestry, your German background, and knowing that your bomb sites could be used, whatever your political views in the war were, did politics ever come up? I mean, you said my Uncle Pete just seemed to brush that incident off in San Diego, but was there ever anything that came up in Sperry? The fact that the work that you were doing was going to be affecting things?
I was investigated very.
Carl, it's Art Milne, and he said, I told him you were busy, but he said only take a minute.
Okay.
Excuse me.
I'll put, sure.
All of us were investigated by the FBI in great depth. We were just visited Saturday by a guy who was our head draftsman at Sperry over all those years, who had been a German, was a German. He was married to a Scottish girl, but while we were visiting, we were exchanging stories about all the FBI things that went on relative to us, because we had a German background. And then there was a guy by the name of Ed Roeder, who worked for me. He also worked, I think he worked on the bomb site some. And he was a draftsman that did things for me. And it turned out that he was one of the German spies that was arrested on the 4th of July weekend in 1941. They arrested about 19 of them. And I had been friendly with this guy. He worked for Sperry. And this guy, he'd been very close to this friend of mine that was here by the name of Freitag, who was here Saturday. And when this happened, we were frightened, of course, about having been close to this guy. But it turned out that in his work for me, he was starting to sleep on the job. And I was getting complaints from other workers that this guy was loafing and wasn't working. And I talked to him about it and talked to him about it. Well, applying hindsight, what was going on, he was spending his nights on his spy activities, so he had to sleep in the daytime. I didn't know, we didn't know this. And quite a few times, and I couldn't get anywhere. He wouldn't. He still was sleeping in the job. He'd go hide off somewhere in the corner. And I finally went to my boss and said to him, who just died, by the way, in March. He was 100 years old, Preston Bassett. I said, I'm going to have to fire my friend Ed Roeder. He is sleeping on the job all the time, and I just can't put up with it because all the other people now have noticed it, and they're starting to complain about what's going on here with this guy sleeping all the time. And Bassett says to me, you can't fire him. We can't allow it. So I said to him, well then, get him out of my hair. Move him somewhere else. Transfer him. Which they did. Well, after he was arrested, put in jail, the reason was the FBI were already onto him, and they had somebody working right next to him in the drafting room, watching him all that time. And they didn't want him fired because they were hanging on to him because he would lead them to the real guys that they were after, the Germans. That's the guys they were looking for.
Wow. He was posing as, he was American?
He was an American. Oh yeah, sure, he was an American. Yeah. He had a German name, but he
didn't speak German.
Didn't mean anything.
Yeah.
So he got 20 years in the penitentiary. But because of that, and well, all of us who had been close to this guy at one time or another, I had dinner with him. He had dinner at our house. I'd been to his house. And we were getting along fine until he started sleeping on the job. Well, then I couldn't put up with that.
So you're doing all this work during really sensitive times.
Oh.
So what?
The word bomb site was never even mentioned. Never even mentioned. Well, I'll tell you another story during this period. One day, it was while I was at work, an FBI guy came to our house, and we lived in New Jersey. Very young FBI guy came to the house, got Harriet met him at the door, and he introduced himself and flashed, like they do, flashed all of his shields and credentials and stuff. And she invited him in, and he said, I'm here to check out on something. He said, it's been reported that your young son, who was then maybe about 10 years old, something like that, says your husband has got some nitroglycerin buried in the swamps out behind Leonia, New Jersey, between Leonia and Hackensack, and there's a big flat river bottom there. And she said no, she didn't believe anything like that was true. I went down there, there were rats down there. I used to go down there with a rifle and shoot rats. That my son Dick had probably been down there shooting rats with me, and so on and so on. But beyond that, he didn't believe anything like that. She didn't believe anything like that. And she said, by the way, he's home with a cold. He's not in school today. He's upstairs, and would you like to talk to him? And he said, oh, sure, he'd like to talk to him. So they got the kid down to talk to him. And the first question was, well, Dick, do you know what nitroglycerin looks like? Dick said, sure, I know what nitroglycerin looks like. What is it? He says, well, it's a clear fluid. just a clear fluid, that's all. I said, well, where did you learn about that? He said, well, I just saw the movie, Tom Edison. He said he had some in that movie and he blew up the train with it. So he said, what was that? Anyway, he didn't get anywhere there. They finally got through with Dick. They sent him back up to bed. And finally, the guy thought he'd about exhausted things. On the way out to the door, he said, by the way, Mrs. Frishy, he said, your husband works on the bomb site, doesn't he? And she said, I don't know what he works on. He doesn't talk about what he works on at home. Never mentions. Which was true. She didn't know I worked on the bombs. That's how secret they were. And that was part of a checkup. You know. Then I found out later they talked to all of our neighbors. They even had neighbors keeping track of me to report if there were any funny people coming to the house, you know, or if what time I got home and when I went to work, and so on, so on, so on. They knew every move I made. So that when this rotor thing came up, I went to the head of the Sperry personnel and I said, the next morning, and I said to him, now that this has happened, what am I supposed to do? I said, I've been very close to this guy at times. He says, forget it, go back to work. He says, you've been checked up, investigated so many times, it's almost sickening.
Were all the engineers in the same, when you went to work, if you were talking, I mean, with the other engineers, everyone was going through the same thing? No one, like my Uncle Pete wasn't talking to his family, or you couldn't mention anything you were working on?
Well, most of the stuff that Uncle Pete worked on was not super secret. Well, the bomb site stuff would have been. Yeah, oh yes, yeah. Of course, that sort of got you into a habit too, you know. Once you've been through that, you just don't make unnecessary conversation about what you're doing.
So you're all quiet?
Yeah, you're all basically quiet.
Straight through?
Yeah, really.
And did things change when McCarthy era came? Did you get
Oh,
more of
I
that?
don't think so. I don't think so.
Same.
Well, I think it's gotten very loose now, by comparison.
All the countries are trading.
We sent a guy, the first A-5 pilot and S-1 bomb site that were produced in production were sent to England on a B-24. Hal and I worked all summer on that to try to, we had trouble making it work. The experimental model in another airplane had worked perfectly, and here's the first production thing, and we had a terrible time making it work. It took us 6 or 8 months to make that thing work on that airplane. As a matter of fact, that 4th of July weekend when they arrested Ed Roeder, we had been working on it so hard that some of us who liked to fish and hunt took the long weekend, it was the 4th of July weekend off, to go fishing up in New Hampshire and upper New York State and so on. And it was that weekend that they arrested Roeder. Now, when that airplane was sent to England, they took off from, we flew it up to Montreal. I think Hal and I and one other flew with the crew when we delivered it to Montreal. And parked it into a corner of the airport somewhere, Montreal airport, gave the keys to some specified guy, and came home, just left it. And then about April 1st, we did that in March sometime, about April 1st, a British crew showed up, from British Airways, with one British military officer and one American Air Force officer, went with this airplane and flew it to England. And in that airplane was a Sperry service engineer who's still living. He lives in Garden City by the name of Frank Joseph. And he had 2 bomb sights with him, spare bomb sights. Now he wrote a diary about that trip. It's this thick. I've got a copy of it here somewhere. And his job was to teach the bomb sight. He was a bomb sight instructor and a maintenance person. You won't find the word bomb sight even once in that book. Not once. And when he showed up in Canada, he went up there on Colonial Airways, commercial airline. He had those 2 bomb sights. They were in big mahogany, fancy mahogany boxes. He started worrying about, when he got up there, how he was going to get those 2 things through Canadian customs. And he got to customs. They checked him out, all his luggage and so on. And the guy said to him, before he could say anything, he said, "Yeah, I see you've got those 2 generators with you." And my guy, Frank Joseph, said, "Well, I don't really have generators. You must be thinking about somebody else." He said, "I said those were generators."
Okay.
It's okay. They're generators. That's how secret that thing was. You never used the word bomb sight. I didn't know that Sperry was working on a bomb sight even until they got in trouble, and they finally were so desperate at the luncheon table that I overheard him talking about it. That's how stupid secrecy is sometimes, too.
Well, what were the other countries using? Like the Germans or the Japanese, or what? They were still using the
none of them
pneumatic.
had anything close to this.
They were still using like a pneumatic. Was the technology similar in
Which?
the pneumatic automatic pilots? Did the Germans and the Japanese have similar?
They did. I don't know if the Japanese had anything. We did capture some German bomb sites, but they were pretty junky. They really were. They didn't.
So you would, if the military captured German planes and bring them to the United States?
Oh, we saw everything that they had. We got at least one of everything that was captured back here.
And what about the Germans getting U.S.?
Oh, sure, they finally got it.
So
But they already had the Norden bomb site, which was the competitive bomb site. They had a spy right inside the Norden factory. As a matter of fact, that was part of the same team that Roeder was in.
So the Germans were using a Norden bomb site?
They didn't know.
They didn't get it.
They couldn't make it work. They didn't have the whole picture. They had a part of it, but they couldn't. The war was almost over when they got it working. And by that time, it was too late anyway.
Was the bomb site used for Hiroshima or Nagasaki?
Yeah, they used the Norden bomb site.
Used the Norden bomb site.
Sperry was out of business. Sperry was not in that airplane, the B-29. Yeah, they used the Norden bomb site on that. Yeah, that's probably the last time the bomb site was used. Although they might have used it in Korea, I don't know. Possible.
Was it there was a big competition between Norden? It was just Norden and Sperry.
We were the only 2. That's right. Yeah. Actually, the Norden bomb site was a takeoff on early Sperry stuff. Norden worked for Sperry back in from about 1911 to 1914. when Sperry did their first work on bomb sites, that went back that far.
Like when planes were first,
Hmm?
right into the first planes.
Almost. Well, the theory then was that the airplanes were too unstable. You needed to stabilize the airplanes. But then they got off of that tack and decided that you needed the bomb site to do the work, not the airplane.
Great.
Well, I don't know, a lot of stories.
I'll come back, I'll get some more stories from you. Thanks.
Okay,
Thanks a lot.
good.